Vous allez bien? How you doing?
Good.
If I speak like that, is that okay for you? Everybody is hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, if somebody has a problem hearing, let me know and I'll use the microphone. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to the MoAD for having me, and thank you to the Quebec government for having me here. It's a great honor to be here in San Francisco with you at the Museum of the African Diaspora. First of all, English is not my first language. I speak French, so sometimes maybe I stumble, or I probably need your help along the way on a couple words or kind of ways to put together those sentences. It's been a month-long tour. I've been touring for a month now. I started in the Midwest in Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, giving concerts and creative writing workshops. Then I went to Laos and then Vietnam, and then arrived in California a couple of days ago. And this is my last day of touring. And I'm really glad to be able to share this history with you. Because I'm a rapper by trade. I've been rapping since 1995. It is my job now. And I've always been passionate about history. And I studied history like in high school and also in college. And there's something I've never seen back home. And it's the black presence and slavery in Canada. Now, when we talk about the black presence in Canada, we usually talk about when the slaves from the United States fled, following the North Star to Canada to seek refuge. This is something we all know, and this is something in Canada that is celebrated. We talk about it, people are proud of this history. But we don't talk about the time we had slaves in Canada. So there's an anecdote I'll always tell. When I was young, I thought that the first African to live in Quebec City was my father. My father arrived in 1970 from Senegal, went to study to Quebec City where he met my mother. And I thought he and his friends were the first Africans to live in Quebec. But then throughout my readings, I found that the first African to arrive to Quebec City arrived in 1629. 10 years after the first African got to what would become the United States, Jamestown, Virginia, 1619. So I was like, why don't we talk about it? This is something I would have loved to know growing up. It would have helped me understand my duality, my mixity, So I said, if nobody wants to talk about it, I'll do it. So I started to rap about it. Because back then, rap was the only vehicle I knew to be able to share my thoughts. So I was rapping about it. But then I wanted more people to know about it because the only persons that I was able to reach were the hip-hop community. So my songs became a lecture, which I'm about to give you. But then that wasn't enough because not everybody I want to sit like for 2 hours and listen to me babbling about history. So this lecture became a guided tour of Quebec City. So we walk for 2 hours in the old Quebec. And I'm like, this is where he lived, and this is what happened there and there, But then, that wasn't enough. So I've put together an exhibit, which will start next month at the Museum of Fine Arts of Quebec City, about runaway slaves. Because back then, when the slaves used to run away, they would advertise them in the newspapers. They'd say, he left, they had a brown coat and black pants, and his face is round. So we don't have pictures of those people back then, but then we have them through the ads where they are described. So I hired people to draw them, and then it'll be at the Museum of Fine Arts for a month next year. And to me, I'm really passionate about this project because it is a way to easily show to the people this history. We get out of the academic side, we get out of the books, we have simple images. You know what we say about images, right? Speak 1,000 words. So young kids will be able to see that. You know, and people who are not interested about history will be able to see that. Because back home, this is an unknown history. You will ask about anybody, say, for how long have there been people of African descent in Canada? They say, oh, about maybe 50 years, 60 years, and sometimes they say 100 years. But people of African descent have been in Canada for about 400 years. And it's time for people to know about this. And this is why I do all of this, you know, so that we be able to bridge this gap, you know, and break this kind of ethnocentric view of history. So what we'll do, I'll start. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. Don't wait for the end. You have something in mind, go ahead. You know, and then we'll get back to the program. So don't wait till the end. Ask your questions, and we have time, so that's not a problem. Maybe before we start, I'll give you a chronological overview of the history of Canada. There are 4 eras in the history of Canada. The first one is the longest one, is the Native era, which lasted for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. The Native era was the longest era in the Americas, you see? In Canada, it lasted until about the 17th century, when Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City in 1608. This is the start of New France, the French regime. New France lasted from 1608 until the 1760s, when the British took Quebec City, then Montreal. And then Canada became a British colony. So this is the British regime from the 1760s until about the 1860s, when it became an independent country. Kind of, because the Queen is still on our dollar bills, you know. So these, and now the current era is Canada. So we have the native era, French era, British era, and Canadian era. These are the 4 eras of our history. So the title of this presentation is called Histoire de la présence noire et de l'esclavage au Québec. So, history of the black presence and slavery in Quebec. And it is important to talk about both because they are not synonyms. You know, when we talk about black presence in history, it's not necessarily slavery. You know, often we see those together, but it's not. You know, slavery is not an identity, right? So it is important to be able to part them. So the history of the black presence, because there were free black people in Canada, even during slavery. About 6% of the black population was free during slavery, which is not a lot. But then it's important to talk about freedom. Slavery is not an identity. But then we talk about slavery. Only slavery, not black slavery, slavery, because most of the slaves in Canada were natives. We talk about 4,185 slaves recorded in our history. 4,185 recorded slaves. And the word recorded is important because these are the names that were found through the archives. On that number, 2/3 were native slaves and 1/3 were black slaves. So see, 4,000 slaves is not a lot compared to what was going on like in a single state in the United States, like take South Carolina, take Georgia, take whatever, no? It's not a lot compared to Haiti, to Martinique, to Brazil. But then it's way a lot more than we thought. Because people thought that there was no slavery in Canada. You know? Until to this day, people don't think there was slaves there back then. So 2/3 were native slaves, 1/3 were black slaves. Native slaves often came from what is now the Midwest of the United States, like Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Missouri, which belonged to New France back then. All of this era was New France. And this is why you still find some French names in those areas, like des moines, that means the monks. You see? So you have a lot of names which are French, because that was New France. So those native slaves came from that area because that was outside, that was the periphery. Can we say periphery? Okay, thank you. Thank you. That helps starting. So that was the periphery of the territory. Because they wouldn't enslave native people from the area of Quebec City, of Montreal, because that's their place. It's like you cannot enslave somebody that lives there. You'd be like, okay, I'll go back home. You see? So you have to take, and that's slavery. You have to uproot somebody and bring them far away, so they don't have any repère. They don't have attachment. Yeah, they don't know where they're at. So that's why those people came from far away in the territory of New France. They were taken during fights and conflicts and wars. So native allied of the government of New France would fight against other natives. Take them, bring them to Detroit, and then Montreal and Quebec City. Most of them, at the beginning of slavery in New France, were from a nation that is called the Pawnees. The Pawnee native became the kind of the first native slaves in Canada. So it became a generic term to talk about native slaves. They were called the Panis. P-A-N-I-S, the Panis. Un Panis ou une Panis or Panis. That's male and female. But then you had Apache slaves in Canada. You had Sioux slaves in Canada. Native tribes are often associated to the Great Plains. But back then, that was the borders of the New France territory. So you had also Foxes and other native tribes. But they were all called Panis. Black slaves, African slaves, or slaves of African descent, didn't necessarily come straight from Africa, because that wasn't profitable for the slave ships to go to Canada. You know, a slave ship is all about profit, right? So they go from Africa to the Caribbeans, go back to Africa, go to Brazil, go to Africa, go to the eastern seaboard of the United States. And they do it the whole year round, back and forth, profit. But then it's not profitable to cross the Atlantic, go through the eastern seaboard, and then down the St. Lawrence Valley, which is frozen half the year. The St. Lawrence River is frozen half the year, so it's not profitable for them. So they don't come. And also, slavery in Canada wasn't a plantation slavery. It wasn't an economy slavery, because there's no cotton there, there's no indigo, there's no tobacco, there's no sugarcane. So there's no plantations. So slaves there are domestics. Like in the States or everywhere else, you had the field slaves and the house slaves. Well, in Canada, there were house slaves, domestics, like doing the chores and cooking the food and doing whatever the house required. So since you didn't need this massive arrival of slaves, that's why the slave ships want to come to Canada. So people who wanted black slaves had to order them from Martinique, from Haiti, from Guadeloupe, so from the French Caribbean. Would somebody over there, a merchant, and you write to them, oh, can you send me a woman and a guy? Especially if they have had smallpox, the measles. So they won't have it. You know, it becomes a plus-value. So you would order them, or go to New York or Boston to buy them. Or back then they would raid British villages in the 13 colonies. Like small villages, like people would come and pillage the village, take all the goods, take the slaves, bring them back to Montreal and sell them. So this is how black slaves were acquired. And since there were less of them, they were double the price of the natives. So this is how black slaves would arrive in Canada. Yes?
Question. So, with regards to ordering, for example, someone wants to order black slaves, would they still transport the slaves via, like, vehicles, sort of like boats, or how exactly would you do it? Since you mentioned before, you mentioned before it was harder to transport slaves from Africa to Canada.
Yeah. So what they do is they bring them by boats, because the St. Lawrence River is frozen half the year. But then all the trade was done by boats. So you had trade from the West Indies, trade from the Europe by boat. So they would wait like until maybe like April or May, or until, because like from May to about September, you had naval trade, but then it would stop. That's how they would get to Canada.
Okay, so it would just be like a specific time frame.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Question on
Yes.
native slaves. Were they mainly domestic as well?
Yes, two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would it be untypical to have both black slaves and native slaves together in a household?
Yeah. People would have black and native slaves together, and they would work together and do the same chores. And then we were used in houses, but also they were used in the fur trade. Because, you know, the economy of New France was based upon fur trade and the fisheries. So they would bring their slaves with them to the forests and hunt beaver or trade beaver pelt with the Native Americans. Yeah.
I missed the first 2 minutes, I just want to clarify. When you're talking about New France, are you including Acadia?
No, Acadia was another thing. So New France was the whole of the St. Lawrence Valley down to the American Midwest now. And then you had Acadia and Nova Scotia and those parts. Yeah. So the first mention of a black person in Canada was in 1604. So Quebec City was founded in 1608. But that wasn't the first try of Samuel de Champlain to have a colony, a French colony in Canada. So in 1604, they settled on an island, l'île Sainte-Croix, Holy Cross Island, which is now Dutchett Island, in between Maine and Canada. So they tried to settle on that island, but that was hard. And that was their first winter. They weren't used to Canadian winter, coming from France, so they had like little wool jackets, and that was hard, you know. And they didn't feed well, so they caught scurvy, and somebody died. And this is what was written back then. Le sieur de Coutrincourt fit ouvrir un nègre qui mourut de cette maladie en notre voyage, lequel se trouva avoir les parties bien saines, hormis l'estomac, lequel avait des rides comme ulcéré. Translation. So the sire of Coutrincourt had a nigger open who died of this disease in our trip. He had, his stomach was riddled. Let's say like that, was harder to translate. But they did an autopsy on him. He died from scurvy, and they did an autopsy. We don't know nothing about him, but we know he was black because they call him a nigger who died of this disease. And this is the first mention of a black person in Canada before even the city of Quebec was founded. But he wasn't the only black person with Samuel de Champlain on this expedition. There was another man, and we know a little bit more about him, and it is Mathieu d'Acosta. Mathieu d'Acosta wasn't a slave. He wasn't a slave. He was a free man. And he was an interpreter. He was an interpreter in between the Europeans and the natives. So we don't know a lot about him. We know that when they moved from the Île Sainte-Croix, from the Holy Cross Island, to Port-Royal, they settled there for a couple of years. And Mathieu d'Acosta was their interpreter. He was snatched by a Dutch merchant ship who stopped the French ship, and they took the beaver pelt, they took the cannons, and they took Mathieu d'Acosta. Because d'Acosta spoke French, Portuguese, Dutch, and Mi'kmaq. Mi'kmaq are the native people. M-I-C-M-A-C. Were native people in that area, like in Acadia and those parts. So he was brought to Amsterdam. And Pierre du Gagemont, who was Samuel de Champlain's boss, was able to retrieve the pelts, retrieve the cannons, and retrieve Mathieu d'Acosta from the Dutch. That was in 1608. And then they were preparing to found Quebec City, and they wanted Mathieu d'Acosta to join them. But Samuel de Champlain was already gone to Quebec City, to found Quebec City. But they really wanted him to participate. So they signed the contract early. They said, listen, we'll sign the contract right away, and we'll pay you each month. We'll pay you a certain amount of money until next year when you'll be able to join them. So they really wanted him to be part of the expedition. They hired him like a year in advance and pay him each month. So Mathieu d'Acosta signed the contract, and we lose trace of him. And we find him in jail in Le Havre for insolence. Insolence, yeah. Yeah, and that's the last we hear of him. That's all we know. Yeah, he talked back. See, a free black man in 1600s. So, yeah, that's what happened. And we don't know nothing else about him. But what we know is that he's not the only black interpreter in the Americas history. Like in the 1500s, the first person, the first non-native person to come to what would become Arizona and New Mexico was a black man. His name was Estebanito, and he was a scout and a guide for the Spanish. He was a black Moroccan. Then in 1613, right around the years of Mathieu d'Acosta, 1613, the first non-native person to live on Manhattan Island was a black man. His name was Jean Rodriguez, and he was an interpreter also. And so there is this long line of black interpreters. Because when the Portuguese came to the west part of Africa in the 1400s, a lot of them settled there. They called them the lanzados, those who throw themselves. They were merchants who would live in a little trade post on the seaboard of Africa, and they would take local wives. So those people who were born from those unions were half African, half Portuguese, spoke those two languages, and they were used as interpreters. And they would pass on this tradition from father to son or daughter. And this is how you have this line of black or African interpreters. So how did Mathieu d'Acosta become interpreter of native language? We don't know. But what might happen is that he would, because back then a lot of fishermen would come to Canada. Fishermen from England, from Portugal, from France, from Spain. And they would settle like for a couple months. And they would fish the cod and whales and trade with the natives. So when you spend a couple months there, you would get to learn like pelt, what's the name in native language, and this and that. So probably that he accompanied fishermen back then. And this is how he was able to speak Mi'kmaq. So the guy who died from scurvy came to Canada and died. Matthew d'Acosta came to Canada and left. But the first person of African descent, the first African to live permanently in Canada, arrived in 1629. So Quebec City was founded in 1608. 21 years later, the British took the city. The Kirk brothers, took the city. They were kind of pirates working for the British Crown. They took the city, and they brought with them a little slave boy from Madagascar. He was about 10 years old. And they sold him to a trader, a Frenchman from the colony, who was working for them. And he was sold 50 écus, 50 écus. I don't know écu what it is in English, but he was sold. When the French took the colony back in 1632, the Kirk brothers left, the trader left also, because he's a trader, he won't wait for the French people to come back. But before he went, he gave this little boy to Guillaume Couillard. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Quebec's politics, but Couillard, our last premier, his name was Philippe Couillard, and that was his ancestor. So he was given to Guillaume Couillard, and Guillaume Couillard sent him to a Jesuit school. Like the Jesuits, they came back to Canada and built this little shabby house around Quebec City, and he was sent to a school. And this is what was written by Paul le Jeune, the Jesuit father, in 1633. Je suis devenu régent en Canada. J'avoue l'autre jour un petit sauvage de côté, et de l'autre un petit nègre ou mort, à qui j'apprenais à connaître les lettres. Et je n'en vois point changer ces deux étudiants pour le plus grand auditoire de France. So, he said, I became a teacher in Canada. I had on one side a little savage boy, and on the other side, a little nigger or more, to whom I taught the ABCs. I wouldn't have traded those two students for big audiences in France. So this young boy I'm talking about is the first slave to live in Canada, but beyond his slave status, the first African to live in Canada. And one of our first students in the whole history of Canada, one of our first students was a young slave from Madagascar. And naturally, we don't have a lot of information about him. So, and most of the information come from Paul le Jeune. A couple of months later, he writes, today made me laugh. We told him that soon we would baptize him and that he'd become like us. And he started to cry. And I asked him, why'd you cry? He said, well, if you said I'll be like you, you take off my skin. So he thought that being baptized would be like skin. Yeah. So he was baptized a couple of months ago, a couple of months later, and they gave him the name Olivier le Jeune. Olivier le Jeune, first slave in Canada. Olivier le Jeune, first African to live in Canada, and one of our first students. Naturally, Olivier le Jeune is not his native name. And this is the thing with slavery also. You know, they strip you of your name, your African name. So he was given le Jeune to honor his teacher, Paul le Jeune. And Olivier le Jeune will spend his whole life in Quebec City. So we don't know what happened with him. Did Guillaume Couillard free him or not? We don't know. But we know that Guillaume Couillard's son had slaves, native slaves. So Olivier Lejeune died in 1654 and was interred in Quebec City, the first European cemetery in Quebec City. And in 2 days, I have a book coming out, a children's book about Olivier Lejeune, to honor him, and so that people, young people, will be able to learn about Olivier Lejeune. And the book is called A Grain of Sand, lost in the snow tempest.
A grain of what?
A grain of sand.
Sand?
Sand.
Of sand.
Yes.
Is it going to be also printed in English? Will we
Not
be able to
yet.
get it?
I would love to, but
on
you come out in
Amazon.
French.
Okay. or French. Will it be on Amazon?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Le grain de sable, en français. So afterward, most of the slaves who came to Canada were native slaves. So for the maybe 2 or 3 decades that followed, they were native slaves. And this is the only picture of a pani slave we have, of a native slave. So the word pani came about because at first people would have native slaves, and you record them, you register them, and you'd say like, okay, I have a 2 Sioux slave and a Apache slave. But the thing is, they were seized during war, and when the government of France would make peace, let's say they make peace with the Apaches, then the Apaches would be like, okay, now it's peace, let us have our prisoners back. The people you took prisoner, let us have them back. But then they were sold in Montreal. So you have to go and knock at doors and, okay, now the slave you bought, we have to bring them back, for diplomatic reasons. So people kind of got to it kind of fast. So they would register them under the name Pani, because Pani had been enslaved for a long time. So every native slaves who will come to Canada were registered under the name Pani. So you know that the government wouldn't come and knock at your house and try to take them back to where they were from. So in the 1680s, the government of New France started to have to trade informations about slavery with the King of France, Louis XIV, Louis XIV. In 1684, it is during the war against the Iroquois. The Iroquois were from the northeast, New York State, and Quebec also. And the King of France wrote to the governor. He said, try not to kill him, because the Iroquois, they are tall, they are robust, they are strong. Try not to kill him. Make him prisoner and send him to France. We'll put them to good use in the galleys. In the galleys where people row. A lot of people, they row. So back then in the galleys, there were 2 types of Galerians. Who say Galerians? Well, now we can. Because in French, we say Galériens. Those people who are in the galleys. So you had the people who were condemned to the galleys, like French people, condemned to 5 years, 10 years, life. And then you had slaves who were from Northern Africa, from West Africa. And for a couple of years, natives from Canada. They were rowing in the galleys, in the French galleys in the Mediterranean. And some were brought back to Canada to be able to foster the peace with the Iroquois. And then in 1688 also, there were talks about slavery. The governor wrote to the King of France and said, please let us have some slaves. The 13 colonies, they developed well because they have slaves. Here, our domestics cost too much. So please let us have slaves. And the King of France is like, no problem, go ahead. No, because there were slaves in every European colonies back then. So it's not a strange request. But be careful as they not die because of the weather. Because they thought that African people were going to survive the Canadian winters. And what is, I'm about to say interesting, but this is something that, an argument that was used throughout the centuries until the 20th century, when Canada tried to pass a law to forbid black people to come to Canada. This is what they were saying. You know, the Canadian weather is not fit for black people, so we should forbid their entrance to Canada. So they passed a law in 1909 to forbid Indians from India to come to Canada. Then in 1911, a lot of people would flee the United States because of racism. You know, so they would go to Canada. But a lot of people were kind of, didn't like it, so they pressured the federal government to pass a law. But since a lot of black people voted back then, well, they didn't pass the law, but they implemented some ways. So when you were black and you wanted to immigrate to Canada, you had to pass a medical test. But the doctors, they were paid. So that the black people would fail the test. And then in 1923, there was a law passed to forbid Chinese people to come to Canada. So in between 1923 and 1947, there was a law that forbade Chinese people to come to Canada. So the king was like, yeah, no problem, but you know, be careful not to lose your money, like you buy them and they die because of the weather. And people, they thought about it. And the way they convinced the king is through the fur trade. Because back then in the fur trade, you had two types of beaver pelt. You had what you call the dry beaver and the fat beaver. The dry pelt was the skin you took off the animal. And there are two types of hair. A long hair, and you have to treat the skin to only keep the felt. The kind of small hair. This is with that you do the felt. You know, once treated, this is called the fat pelt. Native people used to wear those pelts. And back then, you wear it with the fur inside. Nowadays, we wear it with the fur outside, right? But back then, the fur was inside to keep you warm. But then the contact with the skin and the sweat made the long hair fall. That's how the skin was fattened. It was already treated. You didn't have to treat them because they did it while wearing them. So the fur traders always preferred to buy the worn skin. You know, and the natives, that made them laugh. We're like, I'll take our used skin, you know, we'll take the nice fur with us. So they convinced the king by telling them, listen, we'll have our African slaves wear the dry beaver pelt. So to keep them warm, they'll survive, but then they'll fatten the skin. We'll take the skin off, they'll become fat beaver pelt, and sell them. So this is how the king was convinced. So it was like, okay, no problem. So they didn't apply this technique because there weren't this massive arrival of slaves in Canada. But also people quickly realized that African could bear the winter as well as anybody else. You know? Yeah. So after that, only 4 black persons arrived. 4 black persons recorded. Because if you're not like, if there's not a sale act, or if you don't have, if you haven't been baptized, or if you died and it's not written anywhere, you don't exist in history. See? So 4 persons were recorded in our history in those 4 years that followed. And after that, in the 20 years that followed, 145 Spanish came to Canada and 13 black persons recorded. And if you look at those numbers, it's not a lot compared to Martinique. In Martinique, in those 20 years, tens of thousands of black persons came to Martinique. And we don't even talk about Haiti and Guadeloupe. And we don't even talk about the English possessions. We don't talk about the United States. We don't talk about the Portuguese possessions and the Spanish possessions. See, so a lot of people crossed the Atlantic unwillingly back then. Millions and millions. Okay. Hold on a second. Kind of full. Okay, no, it's good. Okay. So, okay. I want to tell you a short story about this ordinance. And it was published in Quebec in 1709, saying that, it says like quickly that those native black slaves who were bought belong to the persons who bought them. You know, because a lot of people will tell them that there are no slaves in France, that you are free, you're not a slave, and people will go. So it was to reassure the slave masters that if you bought them, they belong to you. And why it was put up is because of an incident in Martinique at the beginning of the 18th century. Because back then in France, they'd say that France is a free kingdom. Once you set foot in France, you are free. That's what people would say. But then a slave master from Martinique brought his young slave to France. His name was Louis. So they came back to Martinique, and Louis went in front of the judges and said, "Don't you say that, is that true that France is a free kingdom?" And they were like, "Yes, France is a free kingdom. Once you set foot to France, you are free." And he said, "Well, right, from France. I just got back from France. So technically I'm free, right?" And they're like, yes. So he got his freedom. So he went. And then the slave owners, they were like, "Oh, but that's not possible, you know." So that kind of rippled through the Atlantic world, you know. And then in France, they kind of changed the law. They said, "Oh, it's a free kingdom, but, you know." And then if you were a slaveholder, you could bring your slave to France for 2 years. If he spent more than 2 years, then it becomes free. So people would come about 2 years and go back to the Caribbean. You see? So even in Quebec City, kind of resonated through the word, to the French Atlantic word, to Quebec City. So I'll spare you all of this. Real quick, so some numbers. So I was talking about 4,185 slaves recorded in our history. Well, 2/3 were native, so 2,683 slaves, native slaves, and about 1,443 black slaves in Quebec. These are only for Quebec, the province of Quebec. So it's not like Ontario and the Maritimes. That's only for Quebec. I'll skip all of that. You see, just here, about 60% were living in cities, for 40% in rural area. It's about 50-50 male and female. So now, slaves, as I said, they were mostly domestic. And slavery also was to show your social status. Like, if you had money, you had native slaves. But if you had more money, you had black slaves. Because they used to cost twice as expensive as a native slave. Oh, no. So a native slave was about 400 pounds. A black slave was about 900 pounds. So more than the double. Because they were harder to get, and they were deemed more robust. No, the life expectancy of a black slave was about 25 years. A native slave, 18 years. 18 years. Yeah. There was a lot of childbirth. Mortality, merci. Thank you very much. There was a lot of child mortality back then, so it kind of lowered it. But then it's indicative too that they died young. For the white population, there was about 40 years old. So you see, back then, a pig cost 50 pounds and a cow 100 pounds.
Wow.
So you see that slaves are expensive. And for a soldier, his yearly salary was about 300 pounds for a year. So black slave would cost 3 years of labor for a soldier. So see that it's mostly rich people who had slaves and people from the elite of the colony. During the French regime, slaves were sold from person to person. But then, with the British regime and the arrival of the printing press, slaves were sold through newspapers. So you would open the newspaper in Quebec City in the 1700s, and you would have ads like, to be sold, a healthy Negro boy about 15 years of age, well qualified to wait on a gentleman as a body servant. To be sold together, a handsome Negro man and a beautiful Negro woman, married to one another. The man from 23 to 24 years of age, between 5.5 and 6 English feet high, and we go on to describe how they look. Quebec, February 1st, 1789, to be sold. A Pawnee boy, about 17 years of age, remarkable sober, very healthy and stout, and an excellent servant to attend his table. Quebec, March 17, 1791, to be sold. A young Negro lad, about 18 or 19 years of age, strong and very healthy, has had the smallpox and measles, brought up to the farming business and understands it well. He speaks the English, French, and German languages well.
Was this data published, or did you have to research, or have someone research these documents? It reveals clearly that there was the selling of human beings in Quebec.
Right, some did it. First, some historians from the 1960s. Yeah, they researched it, so I took them out from the newspapers to, yeah.
But still the word didn't get very far.
Oh, the word was buried. It didn't go anywhere. Yeah, no, that was completely buried. And this is the thing, in Canada and Quebec, we've passed the point of denial. And past the point of denial is nothingness. You see, it's like it has been denied in the 19th century. The first historians to write about the history of Canada, they've denied it so much that it was completely forgotten. From denial to being forgotten. So nobody knows nothing about it. Yeah. So those ads, they tell us a lot of things. You see this one, we say it has had smallpox and measles. I was talking about it earlier. You know, it becomes an argument, a sale argument, because they won't have it. These are diseases you have once. So if they have had it, you're good. You know, you can raise the price. He speaks English, French, and German. A lot of slaves back then spoke more than one language. Why?
Yeah, they were constantly going from territory to territory or between households.
Yeah, exactly. So if you belong to an English-speaking family, you have to speak English. And if you are sold to a French master, you got to learn French. And if you're sold to a German family, you will have to learn German. So these become also sales arguments. Like he speaks German, French, English. When they would run away, also they would advertise. He speaks well English and a little French. He speaks, she speaks Dutch and Irish or Irish, or so. A lot of them will speak more than one language. And you see, we don't quite know the age of the slave. about 18 or 19 years, about 17, about 15, in between 22 and 23. So the age of a slave is always guessed. It's like about a slave, and like, oh, about the slave is 10 years old. About 10 years old, like look at his face. And then the slave becomes sick, goes to the hospital, and the nuns will be like, oh, we received the slave, he was about 12 years old. And then the slave getting baptized, and the monk is like, or the priest is like, oh, I baptized a young slave, he's about 8 years old. So it would go from 10 to 12 to 8 in about 6 months. So you never quite know the age of a slave. Back in Quebec and Canada, since there weren't a lot of slaves, the way they, how could I put it in English? How they resisted to slavery. Since there weren't a lot of people, well, there weren't no armed uprising, as in Brazil, like slaves would fight, and from the quilombos. You know, there were kind of places they would go and form villages. Or the Maroons, you know, in the Caribbean. Or here in the United States, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, you know, Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, like armed uprising, because you have a massive number and you fight. In Quebec and Canada, since there weren't a lot, the ways they resisted to slavery was mainly flight. They would take flight. So these were advertised also in the newspapers. And then it froze. We'll wait for it to unfroze. But another way to, thank you. What I was about to say, another way to resist slavery, which was everywhere, is to take your time. You know, you don't work as much. You take your time. And in the 19th century, when people started trying to find scientific reasons for everything, there were two diseases that they would diagnose to slaves. They would say that one was called drapetomania. Drapetomania. So it's the disease you want to flee, right? They say you have a disease because you want to flee slavery, you want to escape slavery. Yeah. And there's another one, is the Ethiopic something. It is the disease of being lazy. You see, because you don't work as much as a slave. So they would diagnose that you were lazy. Ethiopic something. Ethiopic meaning black. Right? Yeah. So these are ads of runaway slaves from Quebec City, the Quebec Gazette in the 18th century. So this one here, runaway on Friday night, the 10th instant from Mr. Princesses, a mulatto fellow called Jacob, about 18 years of age. And they go on to describe how he's dressed. You know, the exhibit I was talking about, that's inspired from those ads. So this one was posted in 1778. When we dig a little, we discovered that Mas Prentice, who advertised this runaway slave, in 1760 bought a female slave. 18 years later, a mulatto slave ran away from his house. Probably his son. And this is part of slavery also. You know, sexual violence. Female slaves were not only servants. Often, like, they were raped by the masters. And the children who were born from those rapes were kept as slaves. See, because the children always follow the statehood of the mother. If the mother is a slave, the child is a slave. If the mother is free, the child is free. So, and I don't know in English, do people still use the term mulatto? Because if
No.
no, okay.
Not
It's
in
a
everyday
historical.
Okay, historical concept, but in everyday,
No.
people know about that term, right?
Yeah.
Because in French, it is still used, mulâtre.
Yeah.
But that's what I tell people, like mulâtre, it comes from slavery. It comes from mule. You know, when people were used and treated as animals. You know, when people still use the term mulâtre. I say, no, we don't talk about mulâtre. Mulatto. In French, we use the term métis, which used to be the children between native and white people. But now it's métis for everybody. And it's better than mulatto.
Where would the slaves run to when they would escape?
Well, they didn't have a lot of choices. They would go, if they were in Quebec, they would go sometimes in Montreal to Quebec. And that's why the slave owners would advertise those ads in those two cities. But then they would try to get to the United States. Yeah, mostly in the upper states, like Vermont or New York or Boston. And some of those slaves came already from those states. So that's all they knew. So they tried to go back where they knew some people or family and tried to pass for free. Yeah.
Was slavery in Montreal too, or Montreal was free?
No, there were slaves. All those people, it's in Quebec City and Montreal.
Oh.
They were held there.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I'll take you and
Was Quebec the only place in Canada that they had slavery, or was it in other areas of Canada also?
that was in other areas. But the difference is Quebec is older than the other areas. So you have Quebec, and after the American Revolution, they developed what is now Ontario. So they had slaves there too. There were slaves too in Nova Scotia, which developed around the same time as Quebec, in the Maritime province, like on the Atlantic side of Canada. So these were the three places in Canada: Atlantic, Quebec, and Ontario. And there were slaves in all of those places. So about 10,000 slaves for all of them. But I'd say at least half in Quebec, because that was the economic center of Canada. Yeah, had a question?
Oh, I was going to ask if in Quebec they had these different gradations of the mixed race, like from the mulatto, if you had a child who married white, that would be a quadroon or an octoroon. And in Brazil, there are all these variations. Did that type of hierarchy occur?
Not that much. Like they would advertise, like they say, she's of the mulatto color. You know, it would become a color from the mulatto color. So they would advertise them as such, but I don't think there were quite this hierarchy, like rigid hierarchy, like everywhere in the Americas. And probably because there weren't a lot of them. Yeah. There was a question after you.
Oh, so was there like some kind of equivalent to like an underground railroad for like slaves that were tried to leave Quebec, like a small version or anything like that?
Not really, because the Underground Railroad came about a little after that. So it came about because slavery disappeared in Canada. So this is how and I'll talk about it a little bit later, this is how the Underground Railroad came about. But it didn't exist back then. But people would help them. It's like we have this guy's name was Finlay Fisher. He was a teacher in Montreal, and he used to hide slaves at his home. And then we have this anecdote where he was hiding a female slave back home, and the police came to retrieve her. And he greeted them with a shovel, right? Try to take her, you know. So some people would help them, but then there weren't no kind of set organization. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, seeing the bilingual advertisements really strikes me. We lived 10 years in Montreal.
Oh, okay.
And of course, everything's mandated to be bilingual there.
Yeah.
And the precursor back to the 1770s here, you've got.
Right.
And I guess it was because you did have, I guess that was the English period, was it? But you had a lot of native French speakers, so they were trying to appeal to both audiences to.
Yeah, exactly, because that was the British period. But then a lot of French people were there, and some had slaves too, or could be able to find those slaves. So you have to appeal to both.
Was there any difference in the view toward slavery between the British and the French, or was it?
There were differences, mostly in the names of slaves, because when we find the name of the slaves. When you have a kind of a biblical name, we assume that they first belong to French people. Because in the kind of Catholic, I don't know how to say it, kind of rules that they printed out, they said you cannot baptize somebody and give them a pagan name, like Apollo or something like that. Kind of stick to biblical name. So when you find a Pierre, a Jean, Joseph, Mary, often they belong to French speakers, Catholic. But when you find a Caesar, a Pompey, Plato, a Nero, a lot of slaves were called those names. But it's okay, they belong to English-speaking people. Yeah.
What about the Mi'kmaq people and the Africans? Was there a relationship? Did sometimes the African people escape to the Mi'kmaq?
Some would escape to the natives, yeah. And some would have children together, not at the same extent as what was going on like in Florida, New Orleans with the Seminole, but it would happen. And even in the 19th century, some people would think about Georges Bonga. I show you a picture of him. His father was black, and his mother was Ojibwe from the Midwest. Yeah, so you would have relations like that. I think, sir, and you after that.
I apologize if you've already addressed this, but was the slavery as brutal there as it was here?
I didn't talk about it, but that was different. Like, we haven't found no traces of like public flogging and chains and stuff like that, you know, because since there weren't a lot of them, they didn't have to like have a lot of violence to keep the slaves in check. So when there's a lot of them, it's like, let's say like on a plantation, you have a family of maybe 10 persons and you have 100 slaves, have to, you know. So, and I have people, when I do the tour, I have people like from the Caribbean, like from Martinique with me. That was light slavery, you know. But then people use that as an argument too. Back home, they say, why do you talk about it? That was easy slavery. And I'm like, slavery is slavery. You know, like you buy people, you sell them, you know, you rape them. But there aren't those type of physical abuse. Except you had the mental abuse and you had rapes too. You know? But then you didn't have the flogging. It would happen sometimes, but in the masters would bring the slave to a jailhouse. And they will pay the people there to whip the slave. But it didn't happen a lot. And but it happened a couple times, and prisoners too would receive the whip too. Yeah. Sir?
Was there, I know in the U.S., particularly in the South and the Midwest, there was a lot of lynchings that happened, and so hangings. And so was that something that happened in Quebec or other places in Canada?
No. This is not, I didn't read about it in Quebec. I know that there has been some racial violences in Ontario, but not as frequent as what happened here. But I don't know even if it happened a lot, but I know that I read some instances where it happened. but not lynching per se. But people would go to a place where you had a lot of people, black people would burn the stores, like what happened on Black Wall Street here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There was a hand raised.
You mentioned the coming together of blacks and the Panis, the native people. In America, that too happened to a certain level, but then when white slave owners would put up signs saying you'll pay, significant ransom money for the capture and return of slaves, did the native people also forsake their black?
I don't know. I don't know about it. Maybe sometimes, maybe not. I think it comes down to a human level then. And the thing with this history is that there is a lot to discover, and there is a lot to research. In the United States, you have a lot of things written about it, and you have a lot of documents about it. But back home, we don't have a lot of stuff. So there are still a lot of gray areas. So I don't know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jacob, mulatto. We're talking about mulattoes. This one here, and I pick up the pace a little bit, but those 3 ads are for the same person. See, ran away from the praying office in Quebec on Sunday night, the 25th instant, a Negro lad named Joe, born in Africa, about 20 years of age. Ran away from the praying office in Quebec, a Negro lad named Joe, born in Africa, about 21 years of age. From the printing office in Quebec, a Negro lad named Joe, born in Africa, named 22 years of age. It is Joe who always runs away. So he's the slave with the most ads to his name, because he's always running away. He was born in Africa, free, and he didn't accept his statehood. So he belonged to William Brown, who's the printer of the Quebec City. So he doesn't cost a lot of things to print the ads, So Joe runs away, he's picked up. Runs away again, he's picked up again. And then William Brown's like, I'll teach you the printing business. So he learns the printing business, then runs away. He get caught. And then William Brown's like, you know what? I'll give you a little money. Like each week, I'll give you a little something. So Joe took the money and ran away. He's caught. He's sent to jail. Runs away from jail. He's caught. And then William Brown dies. Joe runs away. And then the people who bought the press and bought the newspaper and Joe, from William Brown, they open the account book. And they read all the things that cost Joe, like he ran away, a reward, like $8 reward, $4. You want to jail somebody, you have to pay. And like, oh, okay, it costs a lot. So they kind of let it go. And this is the last we heard from Joe. Mm-hmm. So hopefully, was able to escape and live a good life. So as I said, the ways to resist slavery back then was mostly flight. But then there's somebody else who did something different. She is the most notorious slave in our history. Her name was Marie-Joseph Angélique, condemned to death for burning half Montreal back then. No, maybe not half, but it's more dramatic like that. Let's say 50 houses, to be precise and rigorous. But first, before I talk about Marie-Joseph Angélique, I need to talk about Mathieu Léveillé. Mathieu Léveillé was the executioner and a slave. Back in the 1730s, the executioner was somebody that was isolated, like he was ostracized. Can we say ostracized? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So nobody talked to him, and it was always hard to find an executioner because nobody wanted to be executioner. No, he lived in a little corner of the city. Nobody would talk to him. He'd go to the marketplace, and the merchants would turn their back, and the executioner picks up the food he wants and then goes back home. So it's a pretty hard job, and you have to kill people too. In 1733, can't find an executioner. He just died. Nobody wants to be it. So I was like, you know what? Let's buy a slave. So they went to Martinique to buy a slave who was condemned to death for escaping 3 times his plantation. Escaped one time, there was a hot iron, a lily on his shoulder. Escaped 2 times, the other shoulder, branded. 3rd time, condemned to death. So they come to him, into his jail cell, and they're like, listen, now you have the choice. Whether kill you, or you go and kill people in Canada. So it's like, okay, I'll go. So Mathieu Léveillé gets to Quebec City. And a couple months later, he did his first execution. Marie-Joseph. Yeah. She was born in Portugal, or the Madeira Island, which belonged to Portugal. She was bought by a Dutch merchant. He brought her to New York City, and he sold her to a Montreal merchant, François Poulain de Francheville. In Montreal, François Poulain de Francheville dies a couple years later. And all his belongings and his slave are willed to his wife, Thérèse Couane, dite la veuve de Francheville, the Francheville widow. And they have a really strained relationship. Like, people hear them yelling and screaming at each other. Like the widow Francheville, she's like, I'm tired of you, I'll sell you. I found a bar in Quebec City, I'll sell you. And apparently that Marie-Joseph Angélique is like, and I'll burn you. That's what came out. So, February 1734, Marie-Joseph Angélique ran away with her lover, who was a white man from Montreal, and they fled together. They got caught. Marie-Joseph Angélique was sent back to her mistress. And April 10th, 1734, during the night, there was a fire that started in the house of the Francheville widow and spread to 50 houses in Montreal. And when people started to think about it, they were like, you know the fire that started at the Francheville widow? Don't you remember that Marie-Joseph Angélique was always screaming at her that she would try to burn her down? And don't you remember that she tried to flee 2 months ago? That's her. That's Marie-Joseph Angélique. She lighted the fire to cover her escape. So she was caught. She was arrested and condemned to death. Condemned to have her hands cut, burnt alive, and her ashes spread to the wind. But back then, even though you were a slave, you could appeal the sentence. So she appealed the sentence, and she was condemned to be hung, her body burnt, and ashes spread to the wind. June 21st, 1734. Mathieu Léveillé enters the jail cell of Marie-Joseph Angélique and applies to her what we call the question ordinaire et extraordinaire. The ordinary and extraordinary questions. You put planks along the legs, and you put in wedges to break the legs, to get a confession. Because back then they were saying that they never executed innocent people. So they torture you until you say you did it. So Mathieu Léveillé started putting the wedges. And she's like, I did it. But then he continues, because they wanted her to denounce her lover, Jacques Thibault, which she never did. And then, in the afternoon of June 21st, 1734, she was brought on the public square in Montreal, where she was hung her body burnt, and ashes spread to the wind. By Mathieu Léveillé. His first execution. And since then, he became depressed. A lot. So think about it. You know, Mathieu Léveillé, he wanted to be free. You know, to the cost of his life. Like, he escaped 3 times his plantation. And now, he's a slave, executioner, and black in Canada. So he's 3 times ostracized. And his first execution is probably the first black woman he met being there. So it kind of weighed heavy for a long time, for 8 years. At which point, one day, they come to him and they're like, hey, you're always depressed. You know what? We'll buy you a wife. So they went to Martinique to buy a female slave who was condemned to death for escaping 3 times a plantation. Her name was Angélique Denise. So they stepped to her. They're like, listen, you have the choice. We either kill you, or you go and marry the guy who kills people in Canada. So she's like, I'll go. So Angélique Denise got to Quebec City. And Mathieu Léveillé was sick. And they didn't want him to meet because they didn't want to contaminate their new body. You know, cattle slavery. So you don't want to lose money, you know, so you wait. You wait, and Mathieu Léveillé died. So they're like, okay, died, what do we do with the girl? Let's sell her. So she was sold to a merchant from Quebec City. His name was Étienne Charret. And what did Étienne Charret do with Angélique Denise? They had children. He freed her, then married her. Exactly in that order, which tells a lot. You know, the fact that they had children first brings us back to rape. No? But the fact that he freed her, then married her, shows us that, first of all, back then, if you were free, you could not marry somebody who's a slave. It's like you want to marry like a horse or a table. No, you can't. You just can't. So you have to be both slaves or both free. And the fact that he was able to marry her shows us that they were a mixed couple for a long time in Canada. Like we know about native and white couples. But then you have native and black and white people who could marry. Like in front of the priest, they would bless the union, they could marry. Was it seen from a good eye in the society? No. But they had the right to marry. And often there was people from the lower classes of society who would marry the mixed. So as for Marie-Joseph Angélique, often people say that she was a scapegoat. There was the fire, and they kind of put that on her, and they killed her for that. Which is quite possible. But the question I ask, if she did it for real, shouldn't we celebrate the fact that she did it? You know, because she took matter in her own hands, you know, being a slave all her life, told what to do. And then the only time she takes matter in her own hands, we say that she's still a victim all her life. And now that she stands up, we still say she's a victim. If we want to honor her memory, we got to think about it. If she did it, we should celebrate the fact that she did it. Yeah. Okay. Now, I'll skip that. Real quick, these are people who owned slaves back then, like many governors had slaves. And look, this one has 21, this one has 27 slaves. That's a lot. And it had slaves like black slaves, native slaves, Apaches, Sioux, and even Inuit. No, the Inuit are from up there in Canada. They had two Inuit slaves. Like, man, you went far. And this guy, Vaudreuil Cavagnal, is the one who lost the French colony. Like, he lost the battle, then he became the British regime, and he had to go to France to make amends to the king, and he was imprisoned, jailed at the Bastille, and he asked the right to be jailed with one of his slaves. His name was Jean-Baptiste, a.k.a. Canada. So Jean-Baptiste was a slave in jail, like double. So these are the intendants, and these are all well-known names in Quebec. And now these guys, bishops had slaves, and religious orders. And this one always strikes people because she's really well-known back home. Like, oh, like she had slaves. Yes, she had. Now, how did slavery end in Canada? And we don't talk about an abolition of slavery. It wasn't abolished. It disappeared. Because, there's a difference. In the British Empire, at this time, Canada is part of the British Empire. It disappeared. It was abolished August 1st, 1834. Officially, this is our date to commemorate back home, August 1st. But then in Canada, there have been like about 30 years that it disappeared. How? 1798, you have Charlotte Trim, who has escaped. She ran away from her owner. Her name was Jane Cook. Charlotte, she heard that her owner wanted to sell her, so she fled. February. She's caught, arrested, put to jail, and she's brought in front of James Monk, the judge in Montreal. So they said, Monk, you have to punish her. She's a slave, and I'll punish her. And Monk is like, okay. So he goes into the books of law. It doesn't find no laws about slavery in Canada. Slavery wasn't legal. It was a fact. De facto slavery. So people kind of took it for granted that they had slaves. But there were no laws. And more specifically, if you were domestic, and if people wanted to punish domestic, you couldn't send them to jail. You had to send them in a correctional house. But back then, there weren't no correctional houses in Montreal, only jails. So Monk is like, listen, there are no laws, there are no laws. I cannot punish her. Pop, acquitted. So she goes back to the neighborhood, and people are like, what you doing here? Like, aren't you in jail? And she's like, no, there are no laws. And I said, like, what you mean there are no laws? And I don't know, there are no laws, there are no laws. So the slave got up, and they went. They just went. And they didn't go far, they crossed the street. They go to some friend's house, the next block. But they went. Manuel Allen went. Ruth went. And they were caught. They were brought in front of James Monk. And they're like, Monk, you need to punish them. These runaway slaves. And Monk is like, listen, there are no laws, there are no laws. And every slave you will bring in front of me, I'll free. Pop, pop, pop. Acquitted, acquitted, acquitted. And this is how slavery disappeared in Quebec. So that's a bit crazy, yeah? Just 1 second. So, probably that the fact that it wasn't an economic slavery, that there were a lot of slaves, that was easier to let it go. They tried to pass a law to regulate slavery, pushed by this guy, Joseph Papineau. His son is really known in our history. Louis-Joseph Papineau is a mythical figure back home. And his father tried to push legislation about slavery, but that was postponed. There were no slaves to regulate.
I guess it's kind of interesting, at least from my perspective, is like what was kind of like James Monk's because it seemed like he, instead of this, as you mentioned before, like slavery was just kind of this like a fact in like Quebec, so it's like, oh yeah, we have slaves, and so I think like everyone else, a majority of people would have also thought about that, especially in his Monk's case, but it does seem like that's the case. So I'm wondering, what was like what his upbringing was like.
Well, and that's the thing. We don't know. We don't know because he didn't leave no writings about that. We don't know if he had abolitionist leanings. We don't know nothing. The thing is, for sure, he had integrity. Like, so there are no laws, there are no laws. But the thing we know is that a couple of years before, he defended slave owners. So maybe he waited on his mind. And this is the time where in intellectual circles in Europe and here in the United States, people were starting to talk about the kind of legality of slavery and humanity of slavery. This is the French Revolution, you know. This is a couple of years after the American Revolution. So the people would talk about it. In the 1780s, this is when they found the Société des Amis des Noirs, Society of the Friends of Black People in France. There was an abolitionist group, and there was one in London too. So people would talk about those ideas. So maybe he was influenced by them or not, we don't know. But it's almost the same thing that happened in Nova Scotia, in a.k.a. And this time, there was two judges. One, his name was Judge Strange. No relation to Dr. Strange. Strange and Judge Blowers. What they did is that they would complicate the life of slave owners. Like a slave would escape, was caught, and the slave owner would come, okay, now I'll punish him, give it back to me. And Judge Strange would be like, but can you prove that this person belongs to you? And the people, if they didn't have no paper, no nothing, they were like, well, this person doesn't belong to you, free. But then if the person came with papers like sale, wages, something like that, I would say, okay, but can you prove that the person that sold him to you belonged to him? If he came up with the paper, it'd say, but can you prove that the person that sold him to you, can they prove it? And on until there was no paperwork left. So this is how they managed to kind of stop or make this slavery disappear in Nova Scotia. In Upper Canada, back then, this is Ontario now, it came about differently. It was through the governor, John Graves Simcoe, who passed a law for the gradual abolition of slavery. So in 1793, like, I don't know the date, but let's say like March 8th. From this time on, every slave that will be born will be slave for 25 years. So that's a bit strange because the life expectancy of a slave is about 25 years. You see? And the person who's born March 7th will be a slave all his life. But then if you're born March 8th, you're a slave for 25 years. So that was a way kind of to appease the slave owners who were a big part of society. Back then, they had the money and the power, you know. So this is a gradual abolition, which is a bit crazy. It's like abolition or not, you know. Well, even like when the British abolished slavery, August 1st, 1834, they gave a lot of money to the slaveholders, like in millions in that time. Like, okay, now slavery doesn't exist anymore, but we'll give you money. But the people who were slaves all their lives, they didn't receive nothing. No, take your liberty, take your freedom. But, you know, you care for yourself. Yeah. So, it disappeared at the start of the 19th century in Canada. In the British Empire, August 1st, 1834. In the French colonies, 1848. In the United States, 1865. So about 60 years later. So this is how the slaves from the United States fled to Canada. More than 30,000 slaves left the plantations to seek refuge in Canada. But that wasn't necessarily easy. There was freedom, but the mentalities that permitted slavery still exist. So that was hard. That was racism too. So people started to make businesses. Some would work in the steamships too, and in houses. And there was this guy, John Trim. That's his signature. John Trim lived with Finlay Fisher. The teacher was talking about with the shovel. Yeah, he lived a couple months with him. So he was freed around 1793. And he became rich in about 10 years. He did a business of ham. He was selling ham, selling fruits, gardening, bought a property, sold it, bought another one, sold it, and made a fortune in real estate. John Trim became rich. And he married Charlotte. The Charlotte who ran away?
Yes.
Yeah, he married her. And in 1823, Charlotte died. 2 years later, John Trim remarried with a girl from Montreal. Her name was Flavie de Niger. She was white, about 18 years old, and John Trim was going on 70. Yeah. And they had children. And they had children. And those had children. And those had children. And now the descendants of John Trim still live in Montreal and are white. So when we talk about the ancestry in Canada or Quebec, we say that have native blood, French, British blood, Scottish blood, Irish blood. I have Irish blood in me. But also there is black blood from those people who were present back then. Okay. I was talking about the mix between native and black. We were talking about that earlier. This guy, Georges Bonga, was in Minnesota, in between Montreal and Minnesota. And his father was black, and his mother was native. This guy, Jean-Baptiste Pointe-du-Sable, in English called du-sable. Yeah, du-sable, voilà. So this guy was a mixed Asian and founded a trade post in Illinois, which became Chicago. Exactly. And also during the slavery time, there were black people who were in the military here, but also in Europe. And maybe one last thing. This guy, Alexander Grant, he's the first activist, black activist in Montreal and in Quebec. Nobody knows about him. He exists in 2 books. That's it. But this guy was able to give a sense of the community, of the black community in Montreal. And his life is extraordinary. He came from New York, migrated to Montreal. He kind of had people around him. And after the abolition of slavery, there was a woman from North Carolina who came to Montreal with a slave. And slavery was abolished 2 years prior. So all the black community was like, oh, she's a slave, we need to do something, And Alexander Grant went to her and said, are you a slave? And she said, yes. And he took her to his home. And then the police came. And they took her back to the mistress. And the whole black community followed them and surrounded the house day and night so that they want to go back to the United States with the little girl. Yeah. So Alexander Grant died in 1838, and they talked about it in the newspaper. And they said, accident déplorable. So this is a big accident. And they end by, Mr. Grant was a colored man, but respectable and bonne conduite, could hold himself. He was a man of color, but respectable. So it was.
Oh.
Do you have any questions?
I should have one. So, what have been some of the lasting impacts or the legacies of slavery in Quebec, in present day Quebec?
About none. Yeah, this is something that people don't know about. A lot of them, the descendant of those slaves in the 19th century left for mainly Ontario, Toronto, and some through the mixed marriages, became white, you know? So we have a couple pictures painted of the black presence. I can show you them quickly, but there's really no lasting legacy. And this is what we're trying to put forth so that people will know about that. So this is a lot of work we have to do, so that at least it be remembered.
But is there resistance to that from those who are even new arrivals from other parts of the world, the Caribbean and Africa? Is there resistance? Is there a stigma that is still very present in them, so that they don't want to have the subject discussed?
Some people don't want it to discuss because they feel that it's an anecdote. They feel that it shouldn't belong to Quebec's history. So you have people who don't like me able to talk about it. You know, I only bring facts. These are facts. They are very verifiable. But some people they hate it. You know, I'm like, that's your problem. Deal with it, because that's history and it's backed up, you know. Yeah, but generally people are quite interested and surprised. They're really surprised. But, you know, some like people like on the right and far right who hate it. Yeah.
There seems to be much more sensitivity to treatment of Native people because it's such a bigger issue and maybe overwhelms a bit of the Black history there.
Yeah. And
first of all, congratulations on your research.
Oh, thank you.
And your delivery.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
No, merci. Merci.
How did you gather this information? What were your best resources? Who did the university there in Quebec have it, or how did you gather this?
Well,
a little about that.
Yeah, I'll show you in a little bit. Mostly books were written about that, and I try to act as a bridge, because some books are written about them, but it's like bricks, you know, and you have to love history to go into those books, you know. But then we're at a moment where we need to get this knowledge out of those books and be brought to the people, you know, to the conscious and collective subconscious, you know, because in Canada and Quebec, when we talk about Black history, we always refer to the United States. We talk about slavery from the United States. We talk about activists, we talk about Martin Luther King, and we talk about Rosa Parks and Malcolm X, which are great people, you know. But then people don't know nothing about what was going on in Canada and the Black history in Canada. So I'm trying to act as a bridge, and that's why I do different things. I got the lecture, I got songs, I got the exhibits, so always something different. So the process, the first book in the present era was written in 1960 by Marcel Trudel, who was the one to research and took out those numbers. And there's another one I work with, his name is Frank Mackay. And I love what he writes, and he's the one who kind of discovered how slavery disappeared. Because before him, people thought that it came about with the abolition of slavery. But then this whole story, 30 years prior, this is Frank Mackay. he wrote the story of Alexander Grant to discover this history. So I work with those people, but also documents that were written like well before that, like in 1859 there was something written about that, in 1896, in 1905, in 1920. So everything that is about Canadian slavery, I gather everything, I collect everything, I read them, and then I try to make it fit in everything. So I always add other informations. Yeah. Other questions?
Probably have time for maybe one more question.
Oh, right. You're right. Oh, that's good. Thank you. Okay, then I'll show you real quick. I gotta talk about Viola Desmond for a second. Yeah, Viola Desmond, we call her the Canadian Rosa Parks. Because in 1946, she was sitting in a movie theater in the section reserved for white people. They asked her to move and she refused. She was arrested for it, condemned. We call her the Canadian Rosa Parks, but it's Rosa Parks we should call the American Viola Desmond, because it happened 10 years prior. But now, since a couple months, she is on our $10 bill.
Yes.
Yeah, she is. The first woman, except the Queen, to be on the dollar. Yeah.
Where was this in Canada?
In Nova Scotia. Yeah. And in Nova Scotia, there is a bigger black community. Because when I was talking about what's left, that's in Quebec, not a lot of things. But then in Ontario, since a lot of the runaway slaves settled in Ontario, we still have some traces. And that's the same thing with Nova Scotia. There was a city next to Halifax that was called Africville, because a lot of black people came during the 18th and 19th century and settled there. But the city of Halifax didn't want to have a black city next to it, next door to it. So they built the municipal dump next to the water source. And then they raised it. Not raised it, but they leveled it, yeah. Okay, so a couple pictures. So there are so many stories we could talk about another hour. So this is the oldest picture of a black person in Canada's history. You don't see it, but that's a little guy here who's probably the slave of this couple. That's in Quebec City. This one here lived in Quebec City too. So we have a bit after slavery, we have those guys here who are playing music. And in 1837, we have those guys here. So we don't have a lot of pictures about this history, but this is it. And this is the black community of Montreal in the 1800s. And to me, it's really important to show these pictures, because when we think about history and the black presence, we see people in rags, you know, slavery, but look at those people. This guy came from the United States, from Kentucky. He was a slave who escaped to Montreal. And he used to raise horses and received a letter from his old master who said, why don't you come back? You know, we'll put away this slavery thing. You know, you'll be reunited with your daughter and wife. Come back and I'll pay you. And a friend kind of investigated and realized that his wife and daughter were sold for a long time. That was a plot to get him to the other side of the border so that he could bring him back to slavery. Because some slave masters tried to get their slaves back, and some tried the legal way through judges. And judges said, no, the story doesn't exist there. Here. Those people are humans. We won't give them back to you so that you bring them back to slavery. Yeah. And these are the books I was talking about. Marcel Trudel, that's not in English. Les Noirs du Québec, that's in French too. This one, those two are in English. Frank Mackay, Black Then and Done with Slavery. And if you go on my website, you'll have all those names. Quebec History Explorers.ca, WebsterLS.com. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write to me. Write to me and I'll be able to give you some information. Don't hesitate.
So-
Thank you very much.